Hello and welcome to tOdi Secrets, the mini-series in which we will be diving deep, peeling back the curtain, and revealing the behind-the-scenes secrets of my series, tOdi. tOdi is a comedy, most of the time, primarily starring plastic dinosaurs, and I've been making the show since 2017. Just over a year ago, I released the episode Entropy, which was the grand finale to the entire series. So I thought now would be the perfect time to look back fondly, or perhaps not so fondly, and retell the story of how tOdi came to be and how the show developed over its many-year run. We have a frankly shocking amount of information to cover, so I'm probably going to split this into about 4 different parts, and without further ado, let's stop wasting time. Episode 1, Thanksgiving. It's kinda hard to believe it's been so long. This is where it all began, in November of 2017. And this episode is very interesting to look back on. First of all, the first actual tOdi secret that I have to reveal, it's not really technically a secret. I'm sure some of you already know this, but I know some of you have probably forgotten about it, and I also know that some people just haven't been around long enough to have ever known this. But yeah, anyhow, tOdi secret number 1, this was never intended to be the first episode of a series. The original title of this video was not tOdi number 1 Thanksgiving. It was actually a Dinosaur Island Thanksgiving special. I had no idea that I was making the pilot to a new show, and I don't even think I was intending on ever using these versions of these characters ever again. This was just supposed to be a completely one-off skit, literally just a holiday special. And yeah, that kinda starts tOdi off on an appropriate note. This show has always embraced a lot of spontaneity and chaos. One of my personal rules for tOdi, or if not a rule, at least a guideline I try to follow as often as I reasonably can, is that I always like to go with my first idea for everything. Whether it's coming up with a plot line, or solving some kind of plot or world-building problem, or just coming up with a joke or a name for something. Obviously, that doesn't always work. I can't stick with it 100% of the time, but I always try to go with my first idea for everything if I can. And that is definitely in an effort to embrace the spontaneity and kind of improvisational nature of this series. And yeah, that's literally how it started. It was just supposed to be a one-off holiday skit, and the video was surprisingly well received. I got inspired and decided to turn it into an entire series. Of course, that did happen a bit slowly and organically. It wasn't immediately a decision I made right after posting this video, but we'll get to that when we get to it. In keeping with the fact that this video was originally titled A Dinosaur Island Thanksgiving Special specifically, the next thing I want to talk about is just how this series really did begin as a direct parody of Dinosaur Island, another show on my channel that some of you may know about or remember, maybe. That's kind of a weird fact to look back on now, because as time went on, tOdi very much developed its own identity, and I even intentionally started pushing it farther and farther away from Dinosaur Island. But it did begin as a literal direct parody of that show. So the two are very inextricably linked. They are very closely connected at their roots. I never completely escaped DI, though. Even in the later episodes of tOdi, there are still some DI references and jokes here and there, and on my channel, it's really hard to completely get away from Dinosaur Island. Another very notable thing about this episode is just how low the production quality is. I don't think this episode has the weakest writing quality of any tOdi episode, but it definitely has the weakest production quality. For one, this is the only episode where all of the voice acting is being recorded just directly through the camera's onboard microphone, and I'm just doing it all live while filming. And there are parts where characters are supposed to be cutting each other off, or at the very least talking in very rapid succession, and I'm trying to switch back and forth from the different voices just live, and it doesn't work. But that's also kind of fun because it's very reflective of how I was not taking this video very seriously, which again, I think is very well in keeping with the spirit of the show. Also worth mentioning are how weird some of the characters' voices are. some of them are relatively close to how they would go on to sound in later episodes. Like Razor more or less sounds like Razor.
I have taken the lives of many. I have purged the earth of useless souls. What?
But Blizzard is just not quite sounding himself. It's really interesting to hear where the Blizzard voice actually began.
Oh, well hello there, loyal subscribers to the BionicleSaurus channel.
And Silas sounds like a cyborg alien goblin. I don't know what's going on with him.
Why does it even matter? Life is just an inevitable cycle of death and aimless reproduction until we all eventually go extinct like our ancestors.
It's pretty clear to me now, looking back at this episode, that I was trying way too hard to make all these voices very pronounced and unique, and I wasn't thinking as much about making them sound natural or making voices that were actually versatile and expressive. I didn't know anything about voice acting back then, and I kinda still don't, but I have a lot of experience in it. I think I've become a fairly competent speaker and voice actor through just sheer force of will over the years, and I've definitely gotten better at it. But yeah, it's really interesting to hear just how different some of the voices are in this early episode, in this early time period. This very first episode also sort of inadvertently does a pretty good job setting up some things for the future of the show. Blizzard and Razor's sort of character dynamic is actually pretty well established. Really, everyone's general personality is there. And we also, of course, get a very important character death, or rather, we just see the aftermath of it. And that is, of course, the death of Bloodtooth, the most iconic character from that other show. And this is, if not the inciting incident of the story, at the very least, the earliest important piece of world building. It is Bloodtooth's death that, sets the stage for Jane's entire character, everything, and really gets the story started. We don't know that yet, and if it wasn't clear, that was not intentional. It was very much a retcon, but it's the kind of retcon I'm actually okay with. As I said earlier, and as I'm sure I will be repeating lots during these videos, this is a very spontaneous series. So much of the world building and the story was just sort of developed organically as it went along. And so being able to actually tie something from the very first episode so deeply into the story, being able to really closely connect the first and last episodes of the show, that was honestly really satisfying. It's the kind of retconning I'm not only okay with, but genuinely kind of find delightful. And again, I'm just glad I was able to make this first episode actually technically important to the canon in some way. The last thing I want to mention with Thanksgiving are these other Raptors, Razor's family members. We never see them again, but we almost did, because I actually considered including them in a later episode, but didn't for reasons I will get to. But yeah, it's kind of interesting just seeing all these random side characters who are literal blood-related family members, I presume, to one of the main characters, and I don't even think we hear about them, let alone see them at any other point in the show. Episode 2, Easter. If Thanksgiving is poorly aged, but still kind of a charming watch, Easter is not even a charming watch and even more poorly aged. This one is easily my least favorite tOdi episode, and probably just objectively the shittiest. This episode features some aggressively cringe-worthy, sort of enlightened centrist poking fun at both sides, South Park-esque political humor. That's kind of all I need to tell you, isn't it? Basically, Blizzard is fulfilling the role of the archetypical SJW or woke scold, and it's horrendous. The worst element in this episode by far is this recurring emphasis on the air quotes joke about the ZVWQ, or zombie vampire werewolf questioning, which makes me want to crawl out of my skin just saying it out loud. This is obviously supposed to make fun of LGBTQ people, and there is no joke here. The only joke is, haha, LGBTQ people, weird and bad and absurd. As weird and bad and absurd as mythical Halloween monsters. Which is only funny if you already believe it. This is exactly the kind of lazy edgelord humor that relies on, in lieu of actually making any real jokes, just mocking a group of people in a way that is only funny if you already think it is intrinsically funny to mock that group of people in the first place. I know the kind of person I was at this point in my life. I know that I was not actually trying to be malicious here. This isn't the result of intentional queerphobia. It's just the result of negligence and laziness and not thinking even a little bit about the messaging or the theming of my jokes, or even the mechanics of why I thought they were funny. Not to mention that Grant in this episode is carrying out the role of a stereotypical Trump-voting, immigrant-hating Republican. And I honestly think that that comes off a little bit funnier. That one hasn't aged quite so bad. But the problem with that is that, well, Silas is playing the straight man literally in the middle of the other two characters, and it just very much gives off the impression that I am trying to say that Blizzard and Grant and what they represent are equal ills on society. I hate myself. Anyway, it's safe to say that I completely disavow and genuinely apologize for this fucking South Park-esque, irony-poisoned nightmare. But there are some fun things in this episode too, believe it or not, or at least some fun facts about it. For one, this is the first episode with a kind of a proper microphone. It's not really a proper microphone, it's a little handheld stereo recorder, but I would go on to use it for many, many years in videos, and it served me very well, and it is an upgrade on the raw camera audio. This episode is also still very closely tied in with DI, especially with the fact that, like, the whole joke, the whole plot point around Grant being resurrected only makes sense if you know that he is dead canonically in a different show. And yes, if it wasn't obvious, this was also still not an episode in a series. The original title of this video was not tOdi number 2 Easter, it was a Dinosaur Island Easter special. So at the time of this video's release, tOdi still did not actually exist just yet. Just like episode 1, this episode also does set up a couple of important things for the future, like of course Grant being resurrected literally on Easter Sunday, which sets up him being the coordinate later on, whatever the hell that means. Of course, this is much like Bloodtooth dying, another sort of retcon canon world building thing. I didn't know what I was doing at the time. I didn't know that these simple random decisions were going to end up being so consequential years later. This episode also just sets up Blizzard and Grant's general relationship dynamic pretty well. This is also the only episode of the entire show with a BionicleSaurus channel intro. It's so weird, surely a very normal, not weird decision at the time, but in retrospect, it's like so mildly cursed. And the final thing I want to mention in this episode is that the Easter Bunny canonically exists in tOdi, and it makes an appearance in this video, and that is just... I don't have anything to say about it, it's just notable. Episode 3, 4th of July. Why didn't I make this one episode 4? This is one of the most boring, uneventful, shortest episodes in the series. If there's one episode you could remove from the canon and no one would notice, it's definitely this one. But it does have a couple interesting things about it to discuss. First of all, I think this is genuinely the most notable thing about it. This is the only tOdi episode with a title containing more than one word. And I have considered renaming it in the past. I actually think a really funny title for it would be tOdi 3-4 or 4th. But at this point, it's been named 4th of July so long, I think it would be just kind of weird to rename it. And I also think it's kind of fun that there is one episode that is the odd man out. And not only that, it's an excessively random, obscure episode too. Also, this episode was still not originally intended to be an episode. tOdi still did not exist. The original title of this video was a Dinosaur Island 4th of July special. There's also a weird dumb joke in here where I just set up 3 rocks like a dick and balls. I actually still think it's kind of funny. It's just a weird little artifact that I think kind of demonstrates that at this time I was still sort of struggling to come up with exactly what tOdi's humor style actually was. Like I don't think this is a bad joke. There's just something crude and extra stupid about it that just doesn't quite feel tOdi-esque. And there's a couple more examples of that I want to point out down the line of these early episodes not quite knowing what the actual humor style was. This episode also features the first appearance of the interrogator, question mark? Is this canonically interrogator, or is this just a random Chinosaur that happens to look exactly like him? I don't know. I don't know which one is actually canonically true. I don't know which one I like better, to be honest. But either way, it's just kind of funny that, years down the line when I came up with the character of the interrogator and I chose a figure for him, I had forgotten that I had actually used that exact same figure in a way earlier episode. This episode also features one of a couple appearances throughout the series of my face. And it's even in the thumbnail of this one. Also, this isn't even in my notes. I just want to point out that Blizzard calls Silas Skadoodly in this episode. And I distinctly remember that at one point I was planning for Skadoodly to be Blizzard's consistent nickname for Silas. And I think he calls him Skadoodly a couple times and then I just never did it again. And I just think that's kind of funny that you can see traces of some idea in here that was supposed to be a running gag and never actually became one. Episode 4. Heatwave. Heatwave is an incredibly important episode. In retrospect, it might seem like a random deep cut from the early days of tOdi, but actually, it was a super monumental video, and that is because, applause please, ladies and gentlemen and others, tOdi officially enters the world with this episode. This video was originally titled tOdi 4 Heatwave. This is when tOdi actually came into existence, when it actually became a series and I was no longer just loosely linking together one-off holiday specials. Except, I actually just lied to you. The original title for this video was not tOdi 4 Heatwave. It was The Other Dinosaur Island 4 Heatwave. Yeah, so this is another thing that isn't really a secret, but it's another thing that I imagine some people may have forgotten, and something I know some people just haven't been around long enough to actually know, because I've gotten questions about what does tOdi stand for, because I think it's pretty obvious to most people that tOdi is an acronym for something. And that is what it stands for, The Other Dinosaur Island. More evidence of just how closely linked this series originally was with Dinosaur Island. That's also why tOdi is capitalized so weirdly. If you'll notice, no one else actually pays attention to this, I don't think, but I always spell it all lowercase except for the O, because it's supposed to be putting emphasis on, the other Dinosaur Island. That's the idea, anyhow. And yeah, there you go. Not really a proper secret, and something I actually have sort of intentionally tried to bury over the years in my effort to further separate tOdi from DI and give it its own identity. But it is still there, and it's kind of interesting. And if you're curious when and why I retitled the videos to just have tOdi in them, I wish I remembered when. I know it was pretty early on, maybe even with this video. It's possible I released Heatwave and a week later changed the title from the full thing to just the acronym. It didn't take me long to realize that The Other Dinosaur Island is kind of a long, clunky title. So I know, I don't remember exactly when, but I know that fairly early on, within the first couple episodes after it became a series, I did change from the full title to the acronym because I just thought it looked better and it was more readable. Okay, now let's actually talk about Heatwave. Thankfully, there's not too much to mention. It's a very short little episode, but I do quite like it. The entire episode is structured around this framing device of Silas's narration, which is actually something I would go on to kind of reuse and reference later down the line, and I think it works pretty well, honestly. I think this video is pretty easily the best out of the episodes we've talked about so far. We also have a bit of subtle character work with Silas in this video. There's a part where he is longingly staring out the window and says that, no matter how shitty things get, something compels him to keep going. And I think that is quite in line with Silas's sort of dynamic of constantly being on the edge of just full-on nihilism, but never quite teetering all the way off. Was this intentional? Was I already planning his character arc this long ago? Probably not. I'm almost certain that I wasn't. But it does kind of work in quite nicely, and you can see how even if it was by accident, these characters were starting to become more or less themselves. Also, another example, I think, of early tOdi sort of experimenting with different humor styles and struggling to find the right one is just the straight up fart humor in this episode. Not that there's never potty humor in this show, but the way it's executed in this episode, it reminds me of the Dick and Balls Rocks. It really does. And that's it. That's the first actual episode of the series. Episode 5, Hopped. Hopped is maybe the most important status quo changing episode of tOdi. I think that's the best way to describe it. And that is because it is in this episode that tOdi finally gets a plot. An actual storyline. We finally get our inciting incident. Now, I do think a somewhat compelling argument can be made that the actual inciting incident of the show is Bloodtooth's death, but again, that is more a retrospective observation. It's more so an early component of the world building, if anything. The actual intentional inciting incident is Grant bringing over his dimension hopper and Blizzard accidentally on purpose transporting everyone to the endless grass field. But we're not quite there yet. With a show that was so random and completely episodic up until this point, actually introducing a main plotline and, as we will get to, some drama and some more seriousness to the tone of the show, there are growing pains, for sure. And this episode actually had kind of a mixed reception when it came out. I remember some people were very in favor of this new storyline, but a lot of people, maybe even most people at the time, were at the very least quite thrown off. And part of that isn't just because of the introduction of a plotline, it's also because of, once again, early tOdi struggling to find its exact humor style. There is some really poorly written dialogue in this episode. There's a lot of just Blizzard and Silas and other characters just sort of yelling and screaming and talking over each other in what sounds like a very loose, unscripted kind of a way. I want to say that Cameron actually criticized this about this video back when it came out. And if I am remembering that correctly, I agree with him. I don't think it's very funny, and I think it's kind of weird and un-tOdi-like. Again, it's not necessarily like a bad thing. The show was still struggling to find itself, and that's okay. But yeah, like I said, not only is there a storyline now, but the tone is shifting too. I think all the characters arguing is kind of part of that. And then it culminates in Silas being shot and the group huddling over his presumably dead body as sad music plays and it fades to a title card. The episode ends very grim. This show just... I don't blame people for getting whiplash. The change in tone is aggressive and very punctual. This episode does have some really fun things happening in it, though, and some really interesting things to look back on. For one, this is the introduction of Nigel and the rest of the 9 main dinosaurs that get trapped in the grass field. The main group is finally assembled. But Nigel is the most notable one because he plays the biggest role out of all of those characters in the episode, besides the main 3, of course. And we also get to hear his voice, unlike most of the other new or recurring side characters. And his voice sounds pretty similar to the vaguely British but occasionally Australian accent he would go on to have.
Well, I'm afraid your suspicions were correct. Your friend here shows all the signs of a full-on physiological addiction to this internet comedy series you speak of.
I also need to point out just how critical the existence of Billy the Dimension Hopper is to this episode. Billy the Dimension Hopper, I'm gonna bring up Cameron again, was a series by my friend Cameron, or Camosaurus, and this episode basically entirely hinges on Blizzard becoming addicted to watching Billy the Dimension Hopper. We even see a bit of an episode of it featured in this video. And it's kind of crazy to me, looking back on all this now, just how essential the concept of dimension hoppers and dimension hopping would become to tOdi, to tOdi's world building, and to its storyline, and how that was all basically just borrowed from Billy. Like, it's actually crazy how we basically have Billy the Dimension Hopper to thank for what tOdi would become. So, thank you, Billy, I guess. We also have a random Dream Theater reference in here, which is kind of funny because I'm not really a Dream Theater fan, and I don't even think I had listened to the Dance of Eternity at the time of making this video, but it's in there. Then Blizzard presses that button, and we end up in the grass field. Here we are, finally in the location that would probably go on to be the most iconic setting in the show. And this is probably a good time to ask, what did I know at this point? There are a lot of mysteries in tOdi, a lot of ongoing plot threads that don't get fully revealed or explained or paid off until much later. So I think it's interesting to ask the question during this literally earliest section of the proper plot and story of the show. What did I know? How far ahead had I planned? The answer is kinda surprisingly far ahead in some places, but kinda not at all in others. I did not know anything about what I would end up doing with Grant or Hammer. Those are two characters I am confident I had no plans or purpose for just yet. I did know about Cryo, or at least about a character who would be equivalent to him and, fulfill his role in the story. I don't know that I necessarily had a figure or a name or a personality picked out, but I know I had a vague idea of Cryo. And ergo, I knew who shot Silas from the very beginning. I knew it was not someone in the group, not one of the main 9. It was some other character we were going to meet later. And shockingly, I knew about Jane. I don't know how much I was planning with the villains in the show at this point, in terms of some of the other villainous characters or the organization as a whole, but I was already definitely planning Jane to be behind all of it. And you can tell because this episode actually features the most subtle of hints towards Jane being suspicious. After Silas gets shot, Blizzard, goes over to his body, everyone's kind of looking and huddling around. Jane is the only character who actually goes up to Blizzard and kind of comforts him. And it is admittedly a bit hard to remember, but I am fairly confident that this was an intentional hint I added to, have Jane be like overcompensating, trying to make herself look extra sympathetic to Blizzard, compensating for the fact that she is indirectly the reason Silas is presumably dead at this point. It is the most subtle of hints you can imagine, both canonically and in terms of the meta aspect of it. It's a very sort of reverse psychology kind of hint. Reverse psychology, actually the right term I'm looking for. It's more just kind of unintuitive. It's not actually... whatever. So I don't blame anyone for not batting an eye at it, especially at the time. But it's definitely one of those things that, on a rewatch does kind of stand out as like, that's deliberate. And it is. At least, I think it was. It's been a long time. And the final thing I want to talk about in Hopped is this weird old title card that features the entire unabbreviated series title. This does almost certainly mean that this episode was released with the full title in the actual video title as well, and not the acronym yet. So I guess that gives you a little bit more of an idea of how long the unabbreviated version stuck around, at least for 2 episodes. A couple fun little details in this episode I want to mention. First of all, this pillow that Blizzard is using as a couch, this was made for me, ? Or at the very least given to me by a random childhood friend. And when I say friend, I mean like a kid I knew when I was like 5 years old. I don't even remember who, and I don't know if I still have this pillow, but thank you for contributing a prop to tOdi unknowingly. More interesting than that, in my opinion, is the actual Dimension Hopper. It's a fairly iconic prop in tOdi, and it's actually a super old, like classic old YouTube potato camera. Thank you, Flip. My dad bought it years ago, like, I don't know, 2009 or 8, I'm gonna guess. At some point, I ended up with it as a kid for whatever reason, and it is actually the very same camera on which I filmed the first 3 seasons of Dinosaur Island and all my other, like, super old videos from that ancient era. So that's kind of cool. The camera's broken now, it's been broken for years, but it lives on as the Dimension Hopper in tOdi, and I do still have it. It's somewhere in a drawer, I think. Also, this hospital set, if you want to be complimentary enough to call it that, is just a cubicle in this bookshelf I still have and still display dinosaur figures on to this day. And that's it. That's Hopped, episode 5, an episode that would change the course of the show forever. Okay, so I'm editing the video right now, and somehow I forgot to mention that the God-forsaken ZVWQ joke rears its ugly head in this episode as well for about 2 seconds, and just watch it play out.
Now is not the time to reach for ZVWQ brownie points, Grant. Don't exploit your oppression!
I have no words. The utter absurdity, the admission of the fact that this group of people is oppressed, but then the explicit statement that they could somehow exploit that oppression for personal gain. What the fuck am I talking about? For any budding comedy writers out there, this is your daily reminder that anti-woke comedy is cringe. Episode 6. Snow. What even is this episode? This is a weird one. It's borderline non-canonical. For those who maybe have forgotten, or maybe it wasn't conveyed as clearly as it could have been, this episode canonically takes place as a hallucination inside of Blizzard's mind right after Silas gets shot in the grass field, which is a hell of a way. I could have just had it take place, like, beforehand. I could have just said it was like a prequel episode. But no, I decided to interweave it into the story in the weirdest way possible. It's kind of great, though, and it's kind of fitting because this episode was just really random. In fact, this is easily the most spontaneous and improvised episode of the entire series. It's actually the only tOdi episode without a proper script. It was inspired by the 2019 Washington State snowstorm of death, which wasn't actually a snowstorm of death. It's just, whenever it snows in Washington State, it's like a big deal. Anyhow, yeah, like it snowed a bunch and we were all stuck inside, and I was like, fuck it, I want to film a tOdi episode in the snow. So I did. And I didn't have a script. I did have like a couple ideas, like I knew generally what I was gonna do, but it's mostly just the characters fucking around in the snow. And that's kind of it. There's really not much to it. It's a very simple episode, very much in the spirit of early tOdi. Another behind the scenes secret I want to bring up has to do with Grant's voice. For most of tOdi, I don't remember if I had been doing it since his very first appearance, but for most of the show, I did digitally lower the pitch of Grant's voice just ever so slightly, just to make him sound a little bit more distinct from the other characters, to give him a little bit of extra low end. And there are a couple of episodes, starting with this one, where his voice is way too low. Like I had lowered the pitch way too much. I was going way too far, and I just listened to him.
Yeah, I've seen the snow.
Yeah, but have you seen the snow?
I have.
We are literally all standing in the snow.
He sounds so much less like me. Like I can't even barely hear my own voice in his voice. It's very strange. Like most of the episodes we talked about today, Snow is a little weird, but pretty fun, and it also marks the end of the pre-grass field era, which means it is our stopping point for this video. Thank you very much for watching. I do hope you enjoyed, and I will see you all in part 2, where we will be discussing all of the grass field arc episodes. See you then.